gives me great pleasure to introduce the 2006 Dole Lecturer, Senator Tom Daschle.
Thank you. My goodness, thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Jonathan, thank you for that wonderful introduction, and thank you for your warm reception tonight. It's a real pleasure for me to be here, especially when the name Bob Dole is that name that brings us together. I listened to Jonathan's introduction very carefully. In politics, you get introduced in so many different ways. I recall vividly that time I was introduced a while back as a model politician, a model South Dakotan, a model legislator. My wife Linda was with me that night, and I expressed to her on the way home how good I thought that introduction was as well, and she showed me the word model as it's defined in the dictionary, and there it's defined as a small replica of the real thing. So you do get grounded in politics. I was telling Bob about my experience at a retirement home in South Dakota just a few weeks ago when I was home. It's amazing how easy they forget, I think. I walked up to three older men who were watching television in this particular home, and after I shook their hands, I asked them if they knew who I was. They stared at me and looked at my shoes and again looked at my face and said, "No, but if you go to the front desk, they'll tell you." So but Jeff Earl is one of the finest reporters in Washington, and so I've gotten to know the Earl family through Jeff, and it's a real pleasure to meet Jonathan and to see the tremendous work that is being done at the Dole Center. Bill Lacey, I congratulate you for the extraordinary leadership you've brought over the last 24 months. I have had the opportunity for now the last several hours to see what the Dole Institute is doing and bringing young people together and making them even more aware of the remarkable history that we have experienced in the life and times of Bob Dole. But even more importantly, better understanding what the future holds as a result of the investments that we've made in public policy. I want to thank Chancellor Hemingway as well for making me feel so welcome in my stay here. Yeah, I feel very much at home in Kansas, in part because I've come here many times. I had an aunt who lived in Wichita. I have a nephew who lives near Topeka. And of course, Linda lived here a lot of her life. And I generally feel at home in places that live under the threat of tornadoes. South Dakota was has been like that as well, and I feel very much at home. But I'm especially proud to be a part of this lecture series. And I'm proud because of the name it holds, as I said. Bob Dole and I served together for 10 years, and Jonathan spoke very eloquently about that time that we served together. I'm actually very proud to call him a friend. Senator Dole's last year and a half as the Republican leader were my first as the Democratic leader. I served with three leaders, Senator Dole, Senator Lott, and Senator Frist. The conditions for a good working relationship, at least from my perspective, could not have been much worse. It was January of 1995 when I was sworn in as the new Democratic leader. We had just lost the majority in both the House and in the Senate in the terrible elections from our point of view of '94. Not only was Senator Dole now the majority leader, a position that I had run for and hoped to hold, but he was widely assumed to be the opponent to President Clinton the next year. By all rights, he and I should have had a lousy relationship. The fact that we did not is in large measure because of the man Bob Dole is. It's a remarkable tribute to his civility, his pragmatism, his quick wit, his self-effacing humor, and perhaps most of all, his love of country. His sense of fairness and decency is a standard for which everyone in public life should aim. He represents the best traditions of American politics, and this lecture series is a fitting honor to his legacy. One of the ironies of my post-Senate life is that when I left the Senate and became the newly ensconced private citizen that I have now looked back on with some satisfaction, the very first person to call me in my new role as a private citizen was none other than Bob Dole. At first, I admit I was intrigued when he called. Bob said he wanted to see me. And if you recall, right after Bob left the Senate, one of the first things he did was become a spokesman for Viagra. Well, I didn't know if this was a sales call or visit of another kind, and not having used the product, I really was intrigued. But as it turns out, he made a different offer. Bob Dole said that he hoped I would consider working at the law firm of Alston and Bird with him. And yet it was just another example of the kindness and the empathy that so encompasses his character. One of the first things we did last September was to travel to Europe on behalf of the firm for a little over 1 week. In many ways, while we were in Europe during that 1 week, I saw in a very crystallized way the challenges that we face as a country today. We traveled through Paris, Berlin, London, Munich, and it was moving to see Bob Dole look at a continent that he actually helped liberate 60 years ago. And it reminded me of a story that one of my former colleagues told me about a constituent who had been born in Czechoslovakia and had escaped to Austria and ultimately made his way to America as a young man. When the Velvet Revolution freed Czechoslovakia from communist rule, he returned to his hometown to see if he could help. He and his wife were literally amazed by what they saw as the Russian tanks pulled back. The first thing the townspeople did was to rebuild a monument to American GIs who had freed that part of Czechoslovakia in World War II. Everywhere he looked, there were tiny American flags. He said it was like a movie set. He couldn't understand how all those people could get all of those flags so quickly. Then he looked a little more closely, and he noticed that the flags, all of them, only had 48 stars. The townspeople had hidden them under their beds, in their cupboards, before they fell behind the Iron Curtain 45 years earlier. They kept them, anticipating the day that they would again be free, so they could celebrate the ideas that that flag represents. That's an example of what America is at its very best. Last September, on my journey to Europe with Senator Dole, I met with a response that wasn't that embracing. People seemed wary and skeptical. They wanted to know why America was behaving the way it was, and they said that they had witnessed an arrogance that they had not seen before. And this was September, and perhaps it shouldn't be surprising, but the one thing Europeans all wanted to know is what happened during and after Hurricane Katrina. They told me they were struck by the images of an America that they had no idea existed, impoverished and divided. They were shocked to see an American response that seemed callous and incompetent. Their shock was so poignant and so genuine that I almost wish I could have shared it. But of course, we knew better about America's imperfections. If you've been to an Indian reservation in South Dakota, you've seen the face of poverty. What upset me most was to realize that what was shocking to the rest of the world has, to some measure, been accepted as the status quo here by too many Americans. So what does the status quo look like today? Well, the good news is that our economy is the largest and most dynamic in the world. Growth is okay, the market is up, unemployment is down. But the bad news is that our economic growth has become terribly lopsided. Here's an interesting fact that caught my attention, and I've been troubled by it ever since I read it the first time. Between World War II and 1979, the incomes of the wealthiest fifth of families doubled. But so did the incomes of the poorest fifth of families in America. Since then, the wealthy have kept getting wealthier. But since 1979, in real terms, the incomes of the bottom 20% have not budged. The good news is we continue to benefit from modern medical breakthroughs. The bad news is that we pay 30 to 50% more than anybody in the world for our health care. But now we rank 37th in the measurement of our actual health, according to the World Health Organization. Primarily because so many Americans now cannot get into a hospital or a clinic. What would Americans say if in this day and age we came in 37th in the Olympics? On one hand, we have the best research universities in the world. There is an amazing amount of work that goes on right here, from cancer research to climatology. But on the other hand, our educational performance remains mediocre by international standards, especially at the high school and junior high levels. I was the first person in my family to graduate from college. My father was a bookkeeper in an auto parts store, not rich by any standard. But he was determined to send us to college. And I was able to go to South Dakota State University, and that made all the difference in the life that I've led ever since. But according to several studies today, if you look at a 20-person seminar room at an elite university, only one of that group of 20 would have a family income today below $35,000. On the one hand, America wields more economic influence in foreign markets than any other country. But on the other hand, our federal budget has swung from a projected $5 trillion surplus to now a $5 trillion deficit, with over 44% of that debt now held in the hands of the Chinese, the Japanese, and other foreign governments. Well, it doesn't take an economist to tell you that it is not a position of strength to be in hock with your competitors. And the status quo we face looking out from our borders is just as uncertain. There is still good news in that America remains the global center for innovation. But here, the bad news is our competitive advantage is now shrinking. Last year, 65,000 students participated in the Intel Science and Engineering competition here in the United States. 65,000. In China, last year, it was 6 million. Today, Americans between the age of 45 and 54 are better educated on the average than Americans between 25 and 34. And last year, for the first time in history, we became a net importer of technology. On the one hand, we still lead the world in industrial production, but on the other hand, our industries rely on oil imported from nations which increasingly distrust us. We have the best planes, the strongest tanks, the most powerful weapons, and the best trained soldiers. But we are at war with enemies who see neither superpowers, civilians, or borders. Today, these gaps, the gaps between our problems and our policies, are widening. Between our place and our potential continue to widen. They are a measure of diminished opportunity and, yes, weakened security. But tonight, my sincere hope is that Kansans and all Americans not see this trend as either acceptable or irreversible. Indeed, Jonathan would be the first to share with us stories throughout history where our nation's finest moments have come when we've turned great adversity into great ideas and looked forward towards an America of purer purpose, of higher decency, and of greater justice. And the good news today, the reason I can stand before you tonight and still speak with optimism about America's future is that I believe we are still a great people. I saw it today. I saw it in the eyes and faces of the youth with whom I talked. I saw it with the excitement of the Bills and the Jonathans and the people who work at the Dole Institute, excited about their mission and firmly believing that our best days are ahead of us. De Tocqueville once said, "America is great because its people are good." I've met a lot of good people in Kansas in the short time that I've been here today. We remain the hardest workers, the greatest innovators, the strongest soldiers. We remain a generous and decent people. So the question is, how do we build an America that is as good and strong as the American people? And that work can only begin by uniting Americans rather than dividing them. Does that mean, when I call for unity in this great country, that we should stifle debate? Absolutely not. Bob Dole and I have debates all the time. I like to call the debates of our times the noise of democracy. And sometimes that noise isn't very melodic. Sometimes it's pretty unstereophonic. Sometimes it gets awfully screechy. But it sure beats the noise of violence. And it's still the best way I know for 300 million people to harmonize together. What I'm saying is that our debate needs to be underpinned by an understanding that we have a greater common interest at stake. That's an idea that's very deeply ingrained in a lot of us from this part of the country especially. Our history in this part of the country is very much defined by an act passed by Congress in the 19th century, the Homestead Act, which was our government's bold experiment to grant land to those who would be willing to work it and make it productive. Many South Dakotans are the grandchildren or the great-grandchildren of homesteaders. My grandparents came from Odessa, Russia, through Ellis Island, and they took a train all the way across the country to a little town outside of Aberdeen, South Dakota, by the name of Oneka. They got off the train, and they had absolutely nothing to their names but the clothes on their back and their good names. And they began to live out their dream. And as they lived and worked, they were able to find ways to become even more self-reliant. But they understood that no matter how hard they worked, there were some essential things they couldn't do by themselves. It took neighbors working together to raise their barns with very little timber around. It took neighbors to clear the land and help plant the crops because they had to share horses. It took communities to build the schools and to hire the teachers. Later to pay for police and fire departments. It took everyone in small towns working together to weather the tornadoes in the summer and the extraordinarily cold winters in the winter. They understood that whatever their differences, they were united in a desire to build a community and raise their families on those harsh plains regardless of circumstance. As much as they dreamed, I can't imagine that my grandfather, Thomas Daschle, ever dreamed it would be possible that just 2 generations later, a grandson by the same name would become the majority leader of the United States Senate. But that's America. They understood that we could live big dreams. And they understood that by working hard and working together, they could accomplish almost anything. They also understood that what they couldn't do for themselves required an efficient, competent government at all levels. I'm always so moved by the patriotism and the commitment to community and country that I witness as I travel all 50 states. I witnessed it again tonight. When I talk to families about health, about education, or the national debt, the first response I get is that they're willing to do whatever necessary and to sacrifice whatever is required so that future generations don't have to. When I talk to the students today about the great skills that they're going to need to compete in a global economy, they tell me we're determined to be every bit as good or better than anybody in the world. And they speak with a confidence and an optimism that they're going to do just that. There can be no doubt that our soldiers are willing to defend our safety and freedom against any threat on the continent. The American people, if led properly, will undertake any great cause because they are willing to defend and define future generations by their acts. Our country can be every bit as good as what de Tocqueville witnessed when he traveled it almost 200 years ago. But our country needs to empower our people. If our people are well educated and healthy, there is almost nothing we can't do. And it has to start there, by giving our young people here tonight the single best education that we could possibly give them. And then to be sure that they're going to be healthy, so that they can take the reins of responsibility in the not-too-distant future, living up to the goals and expectations of those who have gone before us. I believe that there are a lot of examples of what we need to do as a nation to strengthen ourselves, but perhaps one of the best examples is what I see happening today in our energy policy. When you boil it down, our dependence upon foreign oil in 2006 dictates an energy policy where we borrow money from our economic competitors in order to indirectly subsidize our military adversaries. And we need a different approach, one that makes our energy investments in the Midwest, not in the Middle East. A few of us in the Senate, especially Senator Dole, worked together for years to promote and to build the ethanol industry that today reduces by more than 4 billion gallons a year our dependence upon foreign sources and creates thousands of good-paying American jobs. But we need to do so much more. When I drove across South Dakota last year, I made it a habit every year to get to all 66 counties each year, and I decided to drive a car that burned 85% ethanol. But what I quickly found is there were very few 85% ethanol plants anywhere in the state. I was recently in California, where I learned that there are only 4 E85 pumps in the entire state of California. 3 of them are just for government use. It makes no sense that you can buy a car today that burns 85% ethanol, but you can't buy the fuel that goes in it. We need to push the oil companies to make 85% ethanol available everywhere in the country. And I should tell you that Senator Dole and I have been working now with Governor Sebelius, who chairs the Governor's Ethanol Coalition this year, and her leadership has been nothing short of remarkable. She and 33 of her fellow governors have developed a sweeping, ambitious national agenda for agriculture and for ethanol. And I think her leadership is a major reason that ethanol has moved from a small idea in the Midwest to a national solution for reducing our nation's oil dependence. But I can't overstate the importance of this issue. When more than half of our oil today comes from the Middle East, energy independence becomes a national security issue. And because our security is at stake, we need to invest in the innovation that will free us from the grip of foreign oil producers. We can create a hybrid economy where American homes and businesses are powered by American sources of energy, whether it's gasified coal from Montana, wind turbines from Nebraska, solar energy from Arizona, or ethanol made from corn and other products here in Kansas or in my home of South Dakota. Government has a role, not as a leveler or a promoter of any one creed or philosophy, but as a system of a community and opportunity that makes society stronger by allowing each individual to achieve his or her potential. That's the view that recognizes one health statistic in which the U.S. leads the world in life expectancy, and that is those over the age of 65. And we are recognized for that particular strength in our system because Medicare guarantees that no senior goes without health care. That recognizes the most critical discoveries in treating AIDS were made not by pharmaceutical companies but by researchers at the National Institute of Health. That recognizes that a century ago, some in business said that child labor and clean food and drug reforms would hurt the market, but that now we take these standards of decency for granted and demand that governments around the world live up to them as well. And so, facing a flattening world and a divided nation, we must choose between two approaches. One that says the American people, supported by their country and its government, can make a better world for all people. The other that says this country and its government, with or without the support of its people, can only do so much. As citizens, we choose the course our nation takes, and it begins with voting. In the last presidential election, 21 million people between the ages of 18 and 29 voted. That was actually 4.6 million more than voted in the 2000 presidential election. That's progress, and that's more good news. But there's a long way to go. Let me give you just one point of comparison. In the season finale of last year's American Idol, 65 million votes were cast. Now, I know it's not entirely fair to compare voting generally with American Idol, because a lot of American Idol voters are under the age of 18, and a lot of them vote more than once. And I'm sure all of you were too busy to even watch the show. But millions of young people paid. Think about this. Millions of young people paid to vote for their choice for American Idol, while half of all eligible young voters still didn't show up to participate in the free exercise of voting for America's president. It concerns me when young people feel more empowered to impact something that happens on television than they do something that happens in Washington or your own communities. So your involvement begins with voting, but it shouldn't end there. I understand that what goes on about 1,000 miles away from here in the U.S. Capitol can seem like a world away from one's life. But think about the decisions that are being made there right now. We are facing big, big questions that will determine in large measure what kind of country do we want to be. Will we use our unsurpassed military power as a force for retaliation and protection against those who would destroy us alone? Or could we use it to spread progress and hope all over the world? Will we recognize that our belief in the rule of law is what makes us the envy of the world, and its only real superpower? Or will we sacrifice all of that for a program that can and should be conducted under existing law? Will we strive to uphold the American tradition of leaving to future generations a country that is stronger, that is fairer, that is more prosperous? Or will we forfeit the promise of the future for things like ill-advised tax cuts and other rewards of the moment? These questions may sound abstract, but consider this. The budget that's currently being debated attempts to close the deficit not by asking the wealthiest Americans to give back some of the tax cuts, or by allowing the government to negotiate lower prices for prescription drugs, or by cutting fraud, waste, and abuse in military contracting. It proposes to cut our deficit by reducing by $12.7 billion the federal student loan program. Your votes and your voices can make a difference. But one thing I hope you will never forget is how much power you have right now. Our country has always looked to young people for inspiration and guidance. Thomas Jefferson was 32 years old when he wrote the Declaration of Independence. It was a 26-year-old Martin Luther King who led the bus boycott at Montgomery. More recently, Steve Jobs and Bill Gates and Michael Dell started their companies in technology all when they were the age of 21. That is not to say that you need to start a revolution or found Microsoft or make $1 billion to make a difference. In fact, it is often accumulation of the millions of smaller acts of engagement, whether it is volunteer work or community work, that often makes the biggest difference of all, especially in the lives of the people affected. And that is within your power. Finally, don't doubt the distance of your ideas and energy and how far they travel. A few years ago, I had the opportunity for the first time, just after he took office, to meet Hamid Karzai in Afghanistan. I'll never forget driving from the airport about 30 miles into Kabul, seeing this bombed-out gray palace in the middle of winter, and walking in for the first time knowing that just a couple of months before, the Taliban occupied that very building. There were windows that were knocked out. There was no electricity. As we walked into the first room, it looked about the size of this stage. And I must say it was amazing to see the cross-section of the Afghan people, some wearing business suits and others wearing traditional Afghan clothing. All had come great distance to talk to their new president. President Karzai brought us into his little office. We sat down in a circular setting, and he said, I have to acknowledge something right out of the box here. Our government has just learned today that all we have in our total national treasury is $2 million. And then he looked at us and he said, so obviously we need your help. But then he said something that I will remember the rest of my life. He said, we may only have $2 million in our treasury, but my brother is an American. And because he has lived there so long, I've become very familiar with your country and with you. And he said, I think I speak for all Afghans in thanking you for giving us hope. Hope. And then he said, and more than that, we want to be like you. He wasn't talking about wanting to be like some abstract version of a founding father. He was talking about being like America today. You are the ones who will ensure that nations around the world continue to see us as a light of hope. You are the ones who will make it burn even brighter. You are the ones who will conquer freedom anew. The people my colleague's friend in Czechoslovakia saw that day did not save those flags for 40 years because they admired our Constitution, though they may have. They didn't save them because America had the largest economy in the world, though we do. They didn't save them because they feared our army, because it is the strongest army in the world, in all of history, though it is. They saved those flags because they remembered the courage and the selflessness of the Bob Doles and the American soldiers who left their families and sailed across an ocean to protect the lives and liberty of people they did not know. America's greatness may be inherited, but it is not guaranteed. It is bolstered and defended by each successive generation. Robert Kennedy said, "The future is not a gift. It is an achievement." The challenges we face are great, but so are our abilities. Some look at any one of 100 of economic indicators to figure out how America will do. I look at the faces of our American youth. And again, today, here at the University of Kansas, I looked at the face of youth, and I was heartened by what I saw. Thank you all very, very much.
Would you be willing to share your views on when we should get out of Iraq?
Well, I start that very good question by saying that I think one has to appreciate some of Iraqi history. They were carved out after World War I, as you know. The tribes created in that period of time, the Kurds, the Shia, and the Sunni, had no special allegiances among each other. And they have actually had a great deal of rivalry and significant friction within their communities for hundreds of years. They've always had a strong dictator, going all the way back to the creation of this country. And now we're asking for them to put aside all of that history and all of that extraordinary mistrust and create a democracy. Over a period of time, I think that's possible, but I can't see it happening at any time in the foreseeable future. I think progress has been made. But at some point, I think it's important for us to consider whether or not our resources can be better used and better spent and committed and invested in ways that will enhance the American position worldwide. And so I have called for what we call a strategic redeployment of troops over a period of time to allow forces within the Middle East, to allow the Arab countries themselves to play a more important role. I recall vividly one Arab leader who said to me that it was his view that we were too easy on the Arab countries in the region, that we weren't asking enough of them, that it was really up to them to step up to the plate and help create the stability within that region. And I think that is exactly right. And so I believe that over a period of time, we ought to begin strategically redeploying our troops to fight the larger war on terror and to address some of the concerns that we have in other regions of the world for which I am very concerned. I mentioned Afghanistan, and I'm very troubled by the instability and the uncertainty we have in the rural regions of Afghanistan today. Deploying some of the troops from Iraq to Afghanistan would make a great deal of sense to me, and I hope we do it sometime soon. Yes.
Yes, you mentioned our involvement in the process. Several years ago, this citizen felt committed enough to phone up a senator and speak to his council of advisors, specifically his foreign policy leadership council head, and tell them that he thought that he should reconsider his interest in going to war with Iraq, and that the public support was not that deep, and that the reasons for not going were sound. Senator, that was your staff member, and I'm just wondering why you and other Democrats didn't stand up to this fascist president.
Well, keep in mind, 2002 was 1 year after 9/11. We were told at the time that there was little doubt that Iraq had weapons of mass destruction, that they were going to use them against the United States and other allies in the region. We were told that the situation was only going to get worse because it appeared that Saddam had designs on expanding his territory as he had done in the early 1990s. And so we had to make a calculation. As I said, 1 year after 9/11, with the memory of the loss of those 3,000 people in New York, in Pennsylvania, and Washington, having been so moved by the extraordinary devastation, we wanted to err on the side of safety and of assurance that that would never happen again. Looking back, of course, we now know a lot more than we knew in 2002. But we were hoping that we could avoid another 9/11, and that was probably the most important motivation for most of the members who voted as they have.
Sometimes
Question over here.
My name, Senator Daschle, is Phil Friedemann. I served 10 years at the First Congregational Church in Watertown, South Dakota. Just about the time you were starting to really get your legs under you. I want to say that for the people of South Dakota and for our nation, I want to thank you for your service to our country and to the state of South Dakota.
Thank you.
As a pastor and now as a director of aftercare, I have learned critically how to listen to people. And your undertone tonight matches the undertone in my spirit about our country. Your undertone was one of sadness, disenchantment, melancholy even. You mourn for our country as I do. That's the way I judge your undertone. Now, my undertone, I'm trying to find out if you feel the same way. My undertone is established by the fact that both of our political parties have lost their connection to their vital heritage. They have climbed into bed, in my opinion, with the corporate interests of our nation as well as of the whole world. And the United States of America is not represented through it. I mean, the people are not represented any longer. And somebody put me on the spot as to what I am. Well, I've been, until the last 10 years, a moderate Republican. But now I tell people who ask me point blank, I am a reformist for both political parties. We got to take this country back as a people. We're way out of control. And I witnessed in South Dakota the most vibrant democracy I've seen in the 7 states I've served in. And man, can you export that into all the political parties in our country? Is there any chance, because a few years ago I was ready to get on the bandwagon for a third party, but some wise old duffers said to me, there's no way we can get that to work. We've got to reform each political party. Do you agree, and can we get her done?
I think just about every problem I mentioned tonight is directly related to the question, can we put aside all of the extraordinary pressures and powers of the special interests and do the right thing? That is really the essence of the biggest problem we face in Washington and through our country today is dealing with all of the extraordinary pressures that are brought to bear on a member of Congress, in large measure because of the cost of campaigns. If I could change one thing, it would be the cost of politics today. It is way too expensive. And I worry about the young people I talk to today, about whether or not 20 or 30 years from now, when somebody says, we'd love to have you run for the United States Senate here in Kansas, but by the way, you're going to need $40 million to do it. And that $40 million is hard to come by, first of all, and when you come by it, you meet the powers that are behind the decisions. And I think it's so critical for us to recognize that until we deal with that problem, it's going to be almost impossible to have the confidence that we can deal with the issues that are before us. Most members of Congress have to spend far too much money, time and money, getting ready for the next election. They're on the roads constantly. They're traveling the country constantly, raising the money in order to be competitive next time. I think that's not right. I think I'd support a constitutional amendment to limit the time and the amount of money required in a campaign. I think it's important we try to get something like that done.
Yes, sir. I'm a Choctaw Indian. I've been to South Dakota, and I appreciate what you've done for the tribes up there, but it troubles me when I read about the Justice Department having to intervene when Lakota and Dakota children are discriminated against in schools, in voting districts, or gerrymandered in ways to where non-native votes hardly count where they should. And I'm wondering what can be done about this.
Well, I think that we've had to deal with that in several elections now where Native Americans have actually been turned away from the polls, and it's just wrong. We've done a lot better job, at least in the last election, but the problem still exists, and it's, we have to be embracing democracy and encouraging minorities to participate. Of all the people that have had injustices done to them, I can't think of a group in this country more than the Native Americans who have been forced to endure injustices. Tomorrow I'm going to be holding a hearing in Washington on the Cobell Trust reform issue, and there again, just an extraordinary amount of injustice done to the trust lands of American Indians now for over 100 years. We've got to resolve it. It's going to take resources to do it, but at long last, this injustice has to be addressed, and I'm hoping that we can do it sometime very, very soon.
Hello. Hi, Mr. Daschle.
Hello.
My name is Sandra Blue Dog Melius. I'm Sisseton, Wahpeton, Dakota, Oyate, and you've done a lot of good things for my people from the state of South Dakota. I'm now kind of relocated here in Lawrence, Kansas. I'm taking graduate classes. I'm really a teacher, but I'm taking graduate classes. Anyway, thank you for being here and for mentioning the Cobell case. I think my brother has something to do with that as well, but your voice sounds different. You probably kind of run down or catching a bug or something. It sounds very different. But yeah, tired, like the pastor said too. Also, I would like to know, I've read in one of the tribal papers that you are considering running for the presidency. That would be wonderful. I'll vote for you. I'll campaign for you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I will give you that $5 I promised you just after we leave.
No, all you have to do is have the President of the United States send this lady that's going to be 100 years old on May 21st. She was born in, I don't remember the town, in Mexico. She's such a neat lady. But anyway, most of the time. But anyway, I have the information on my tribal museum pamphlet that we just opened back home too. So if you will take it and please.
I'll see what I can do. Thank you. Thank you all very much. I enjoyed the evening. Thank you.
That was terrific, Senator. Thank you so much.